Thank you all for coming down tonight. We are live from Books and Books in Coral Gables, Florida, courtesy of the generous support of the Knight Foundation. And this evening, Books and Books is honored to welcome back Dr. Amy D Ronner and her new book, Dostoevsky and the Law. Dr. Ronner is a professor of law at St. Thomas University School of Law, where she teaches constitutional law, wills and trusts, and criminal procedure. In addition to her law degree from the University of Miami, she has a PhD and an MA in English language and literature from the University of Michigan. She is also the author of several books on topics like law, literature and therapeutic jurisprudence, appellate practice, LGBT rights, and English literature. And she is the author of several previous books, including Homophobia and the Law, and Law, Literature, and Therapeutic Jurisprudence, which we happen to have for sale at the counter over there. Although Dostoevsky wrote in the 19th century, his genius transcends time to shed light on our own justice system and legal doctrines. In this book, Dr. Ronner examines, through a legal lens, several of Dostoevsky's works, including Crime and Punishment, The Double, Notes from the House of the Dead, Demons, and Brothers Karamazov, to show how they transmit relevant and timely messages about our mental capacity doctrine, confessions, legal system, and prisons. Here to tell us more about it, please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Amy D. Ronner.
Thank you. Good evening, and can you all hear me? Great, that's great. I tended to be a little too loud. In Brothers Karamazov, Father Zosima speaks of the experience of active love. The people that make books and books happen are the experience of active love. I thank Mitchell Kaplan, who is the heart and soul of our community. There's also no thank you big enough for Christina Nasty, who put everything together magnificently and even performs counseling services on the eve of book signings. They, along with Irving Fields, our food guru, are the experience of active love. Of course, there are so many people here that I'd like to acknowledge, but due to time constraints, most of that will have to happen later, one-on-one. But I'll open the evening by thanking my husband, Dr. Michael Passon, the love of my life. I'd also like to acknowledge my wonderful stepson, Mark Passon, a fine lawyer, and his wife, Allison Passon, and of course their adorable son, Landon. All of my royalties for this book are going to a scholarship that my husband and I set up at St. Thomas University School of Law. And it is for the Therapeutic Jurisprudence Scholarship in the Intercultural Human Rights Program. And I want to praise the directors of that brilliant program, Professor Siegfried Wiesner and Professor Rosa Patti. They've created a gem that radiates from our law school. Their students come from all over the globe, and some arrive with very little. Our hope is that this scholarship will grow over the years and assist this program. There's another treasure here tonight. Her name is Dr. Deborah Martinson, and this book would not have happened without her inclusiveness, her mentoring, her guidance, friendship, meticulous editing. Dr. Martenson, an author herself, is the past president of the International Dostoevsky Society and a professor of Russian literature at Columbia University. I'd also like to say that I'm thrilled that my dean and dear friend, Al Garcia, is here tonight. He is one of the finest people I have ever known, and I thank him profusely for being our leader and the talented face of the law school. Also here is Associate Dean Cece Dicus, who is our bedrock. Thank you. I'd like to thank also my research assistants over the years and present, Starkey DeSoto, Nicole Quapis, and Glennis Domingo, who worked tirelessly by my side on this book. What I will do is tell you a little bit about this book, mostly an overview, and then read you a section of it. At the end, I'm going to welcome your questions and comments. I always enjoy that the most. Dostoevsky's life spanned from 1821 to 1881. And in 1849, something happened that changed the course of his entire life. Dostoevsky had joined a society whose goal was to stir Russian Revolution. He, along with members of that group, was arrested and sentenced to death before a firing squad. Officials paraded Dostoevsky and others into a public square and tethered them to execution posts. Just before discharging their fatal shots, the soldiers received a halt command. By order of Nicholas I, the great Russian novelist, and fellow prisoners were spared, and their death sentences commuted to 4 years of hard labor and exile in Siberia. Dostoevsky, in poor health, served his whole sentence in Omsk fortress. In prison, he endured horrendous conditions and witnessed brutal beatings, all of which he graphically depicted in an autobiographical novel. This prison experience catalyzed his interest in crime, punishment, the legal system, and the human psyche. Although Dostoevsky wrote in the 19th century, his wisdom transcends time and place. In short, he very much speaks to us today. This book aims to show how law, in its broadest sense, operates in Dostoevsky's writings, and how this great Russian author transmits messages that apply to our own legal system today. Chapter 3 is called The Confessant Gene. And for my talk, I'm going to focus on just a piece of that chapter and even read a short section from it. What is the main thrust of this chapter? It contrasts landmark confession cases with Dostoevsky's perspective on confessions. In the United States, and I know many of my students are here and have already taken criminal procedure, you know that the confession cases and those in the Miranda context, the Supreme Court has paid lip service to the goal of ensuring that confessions are the product of free and rational choices. Where does Dostoevsky stand? He could not be more mistrustful of confessions, especially ones that meander into criminal prosecutions. According to him, confessions are an elusive phenomenon of infinite variety, and the psychological and spiritual forces that coerce them tend to be unfree and irrational. He believed that in a justice system, confessions are typically valueless and frequently do more harm than good by actually derailing the putative truth-finding process. Dostoevsky's novels are populated with individuals confessing for all sorts of reasons, and some are even taking credit for things they did not do. For my talk today, I'm going to focus on Mitya Karamazov. He's one of the Karamazov brothers. And he leans toward a confession that would inexorably emerge without any poking or prodding on the part of legal agents. For those of you unfamiliar with the brothers Karamazov, I'll tell you a little something about the novel. It's suspenseful. It's a whodunit. And the father in the novel is Fyodor Karamazov, and he's rather repulsive. He's no great shakes, okay? And in fact, he, the reviled buffoon, is murdered one night and robbed. Incidentally, no one in town is particularly heartbroken over the fact that the world has to go on without him. Who done it? Who done it? The suspect is son Mitya. Mitya desperately needed the money. He hated his father and even once beat him to a pulp. And there were witnesses to this. Mitya is eventually charged with a crime. But before that, Mitya becomes romantically obsessed with a beauty, Grushenka, and he whisks her off to another village where they squander rubles in wild revelry replete with partying gypsy women and champagne. Where did he suddenly get all this money? His interrogators want answers. They corner Mitya right in the throes of all of this drunken partying with his ladylove, and they employ nearly every trick in the book to coerce and deliberately elicit information out of their suspect. Incidentally, these old-fangled Russian tactics look a lot like stuff you see on TV. Criminal Minds, Law and Order, CSI. And in fact, they prefigure the ones in the pre- and post-Miranda toolkit. Now, I'll read you a little section dealing with Mitya's confession. And what's going on right now is his interrogators have told him that he doesn't have to speak, and he's got a right to be silent. But they've also told him, don't you realize how dangerous it is for you to stay silent? Okay, so you don't have to talk, don't worry about it. But why would you not talk? Don't you realize how that hurts you? Sounds familiar, huh? Well, here is a little section. The Miranda Court noted that according to police manuals, the key to fruitful interrogation is the creation of an environment that makes the subject feel alone powerless, vulnerable. This subjugates the individual to the will of the examiner and carries its own badge of intimidation. It destroys human dignity. Mitch's examiners resort to an approach aimed to accomplish this. But here it is overkill. The team, abrading Mitch's Achilles heel of desired, feared shame, orders him to strip, which causes him to reflect, if everyone is undressed, it's not shameful. But when only one is undressed and the others are all looking, it's a disgrace. He then relishes and agonizes over each stratum of his unveiling. But to take his socks off was even painful for him. They were not very clean, nor were his underclothes, and now everyone could see it. And above all, he did not like his own feet. All his life, for some reason, he had found both of his big toes ugly, especially the right one, with its crude, flat toenail, somehow curved under. And now they would all see it. This disrobing, which he professes to hate, excites such unbearable shame that he's suddenly inspired to exacerbate his own misery by tearing off his own shirt. In so doing, he literally and figuratively tries to bare his breast, and then, effectually prolonging the demeaning dishabille, initially declines the offered replacement garments. Although horrified at the prospect that others might notice his dirty undergarments, Mitya makes sure that these are indeed noticed when he shouts, "He examined my socks too closely and had them turned inside out. He did it on purpose to show everyone how dirty my underwear is." Shortly thereafter, Mitya, reaching what is and has been all along his unconsciously appointed breakthrough or beachhead, caves. "I'll reveal my secret to you. I will reveal my disgrace." Incidentally, this coercive interrogation changes Mitch's life, but not really because of anything the prosecution or law enforcement does, or what the interrogators squeeze out of him, because Mitya himself does what he was hell-bent on doing all along. He exposes what he believes is his real and worst crime, his most shameful deed. Well, does it help? Read the novel, check out the trial. Thank you. Thank you. Are there any questions or comments? Any questions or comments? Yes. Brett, is that Brett back there? Yes.
Other than the messages on confessions that you talked about, what other topics are covered in the messages that you think Dostoevsky sends to our current legal system?
What I do in the book is explore Dostoevsky's perspective on mental capacity doctrine. There's a whole chapter on that, dealing with a novel, one of his early pre-Siberian novels called The Double, which incidentally upset everybody in his day and continues to do so. And there's exploration of mental capacity. There is also a chapter on his perspective on prisons and what in essence, destroys free will and human dignities within the prison system itself. And what I do is I apply it to today's jurisprudence and to things that the Supreme Court is doing in terms of whittling down constitutional rights and rights for prisoners. So those are some of the things I explore in the book. I also talk about some of his commentary on famous trials of his day. You know, Dostoevsky wrote a writer's diary, Brothers Karamazov, Crime and Punishment, after the passage of legal reforms in 1864. And what he did was spent a lot of time commenting on the legal system and the strategy of attorneys that they used, and became increasingly critical of it. But you would think, when you look at this, that you're reading about something today. I mean, it is absolutely applicable to everything that's going on in our own legal system and today. Anything else? Yes, Alan.
What was his education? What was Dostoevsky's background?
Well, he did go to, one thing, his father was very poor. He was a physician, his father, and took a lot of effort to make sure that his children were well educated. He eventually studied engineering, and he really hated the work that came with it and the studies. And after completing his studies, he decided just to devote himself to writing.
Did he write in prison? Did he write?
No, he was not allowed to. But what happened is he had a few moments. For instance, if he got to go to the prison hospital, which incidentally was considered an upgrade from the prison itself, and it was pretty appalling. There was a kind doctor there that let him jot down some notes, and he gathered a lot of information while in Siberia. He met convicts from all over, interesting characters. He studied their psyches, and many of this emerges in later books. Any other? Yes, Stephen.
Crime and Punishment was a story where somebody had a need to confess. In other words, it was less about coercion of a confession, but more about a need to confess to expiate the soul. How is it that Dostoevsky wrote about a need to confess when he was so critical of coerced confessions?
That is the best question. Thank you, Stephen.
Is that on the internet?
You're on the internet. I approach Raskolnikov in one of my chapters as a type of offender that actually commits the crime to fill his confession with content. And that is, he desperately seeks some kind of spiritual regeneration. And the reason he kills and murders the old pawnbroker and her stepsister is so that he has a confession. And one of the things that you see in the book that's the great mystery is nobody can figure out his motive. Because he gets the money, he buries it, essentially, never bothers to check even how much there is, and it ends up damaged. There is really no motive for his crime except an obsessive-compulsive need to confess. And that becomes an incipient step in his spiritual regeneration and reconnection with the human race.
Amy, how long did it take you to write this book? With all your travel and your teaching?
Well, my students come first. That's something. But every time I had a break, I would work on this book. And I think it's been in the works for about 3 years. When I was a child, I said I was going to write a book on Dostoevsky. That was one of my goals when I was a young child. So this was a book that I have wanted to write my entire life. Well, my father came over from Russia in 1922. It's now Belarus. He grew up in Mogilev. And when I was about 6 years old, he read me Notes from Underground in Russian and then translated it into English. And yes, I sat still. I know that's hard to believe, but I did. I sat still, and that was the beginning of this book for me.
Amy, we have a question over here.
Yes.
I just want to thank you for such a thorough and meticulous knowledge and in-depth analysis of Russian literature. You demonstrate far better knowledge of it than most Russian scholars they know, and that comes from someone who's from there. And in the same vein, my question is, do you already know what your next book is going to be? What should we expect?
No, but I am going to be writing an article on demons. That's going to be the next. That's a Dostoevsky novel, and I will be doing that very soon. Yes?
I think what makes it so valid for you to compare Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment and Michka in Brothers Karamazov is the fact that in both cases, although they seem to come from very different places, these confessions are coming from deep psychological need. And the danger of the confession is that that is very often where it comes from. And do you feel that that's why, Dostoevsky is such a valid source on this?
Well, you just encapsulated chapter 3. That's what you did. Because for him, he feels that confessions really have no place in the justice system. That what they are about is an incipient step in a person's spiritual evolution, relationship with God. And as soon as confessions, and you see this in the Karamazov trial, everybody's telling the truth. And it's the truth that derails the whole judicial process. Even the judge says, your words are incomprehensible and misplaced here. And Dostoevsky felt that judges and juries had no business dealing with confession. It belongs in an entirely different sphere. Yeah, I see. Oh, yes, Dean Garcia.
Dostoevsky would agree with the philosopher Peter Brooks that there is no such thing as a voluntary confession.
Yes, absolutely. And I've quoted Brooks in my book.
There is no such thing as a voluntary confession.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Yes, Peter.
In the Grand Inquisitor scene, in the brothers,
Oh, yes.
we're dealing with an altered perception of what is truth and what is right. Does this carry over psychologically into the mechanism of confession?
Yes. In fact, in chapter 3, I do a very intense analysis of Ivan Karamazov and show how his spiritual dilemma and his spiritual anguish comes across in that Grand Inquisitor story that he transmits to Alyosha. And then I connect it to what happens to him when he takes the witness stand. There's a complete mental conflagration. He just absolutely blows up on the witness stand. And I make some connections between that and his Grand Inquisitor poem. That is the return of Jesus to the earth. Yeah. Yes.
So, since there is no such thing as a voluntary confession, what solutions do you offer in your book for our justice system?
Well, one of the, that's, since there's no such thing as a voluntary confession. What sort of suggestions do I offer? And one I take right out of the mouth of Fetchikovich, who's the defense counsel, Mitch's defense counsel, because he talks about a confession in another case, which is so corroborated by other evidence, so corroborated, and he said, now that's a case. Now, one of the things you can think of is if there is so much ample corroboration, then why just bother with the confession at all and just use all the other evidence? And so essentially, I work with that concept of just pulling confessions out of the process altogether. And, we all know how many people right now with DNA evidence and the Innocence Project are being released. And Dostoevsky talks about a man that served 10 years in Siberia, and the real perpetrators confessed, and he suffered for 10 years. He was convicted of killing his father. And so even Dostoevsky was aware of the phenomenon that we are becoming increasingly aware of today, that there are so many innocent people that are imprisoned. Some have even been executed. And many of these people have been convicted primarily on or solely on the basis of a confession that later turns out to be false. Anything else?
More questions or comments?
I want to say that we're immensely proud of Professor Ronner. We're immensely proud of her work. And for those of you who are not privy to this information, one of her chapters was published by a very prestigious publication called the Criminal Law Bulletin. The editor of that bulletin, James Robertson, told me that it was the best article ever published in that journal.
Thank you. Yes.
Do you get into, or does it get into eyewitness accuracy at all?
Not too much, but in the context of particularly Mitch's trial, you see witnesses that testify, and many of them say they saw something, like a door closed or a door opened. And you see defense counsel in one of his better moments, because Fetchikovich means blockhead, okay? And Dostoevsky was parodying one of the attorneys of his day with that character. But you see that attorney really impeaching and discrediting some of those witnesses and what they saw. So you do get, at least in the book, some suggestion that there can be some problems with eyewitnesses and what witnesses recollect or think they saw. Anything else? Okay.
All right, we have a few more minutes if anyone has a question or comment before we go back to signing and receptioning. All right, well, folks, if there are no more questions, then just a reminder, we have Dostoevsky and an electric personality. We have Dostoevsky and the Law for sale at both the east side and the west side counter. Dr. Ronner is going to be signing over on the west side of the store where the reception is going to continue. We also have some of her previous books for sale there. So this has been a fascinating presentation, and we should all give Dr. Ronner another hand. Thank you very much.
Oh, okay.